Hello, everyone. Welcome to our study of the book of Esther. And as I get into that, I wanted to make you aware of a set of books, a set of commentaries. It's called the Truth for Today Commentary Series, and it offers an exegesis and application of the books that are covered. And this one is by Dr. Coy D. Roper. And I hope that you will at some time access some of these books. The general editor went to school when I did in graduate school, and he's made it his mission to come out with an entire commentary series on the books of the Bible. It's good, solid exegetical material. It's solid academically, but not so full of academic minutia that one's eyes glass over and they promptly go to sleep. And so I'm going to be working from this commentary, and I would suggest that you purchase one for yourself. I have no financial relationship with the series. I'm just recommending it because it's good material. The book of Esther is different from most other books of the Bible in that it, like Ruth, is named after a lady, and it describes the origin of a feast, the Feast of Purim, that's not discussed in any other book in the Old Testament. The book is unusual also in that it does not mention the name of God anywhere in the book, and it is not quoted in the New Testament. All of those things are a little bit odd. It has been both greatly admired and vigorously attacked by scholars, both Jewish and Christian. For example, Melodies, the medieval Jewish scholar, placed it just after the Torah in importance. In stark contrast to that, Martin Luther said, "I am so great an enemy of the book that I wish it had not come to us at all." And so it is evident that in order to understand the book of Esther, some introductory questions about the book at least need to be examined and hopefully some of them answered. First of all, we're going to notice how it's named and the classification of the book. It's named, as I've indicated, after a lady. It is the main character. She's the main character in the writing. The word Esther, or the name Esther, is a Persian word that means star. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, and that means myrtle. In the Hebrew Bible, the book is classified among the writings. It's one of the megaloth, or scrolls, one of the 5 small scrolls that are read at the various Jewish feasts on an annual basis. And this book is read annually at the Feast of Purim. In the English Old Testament, it is classified among the books of history, coming after Ezra and Nehemiah. And the reason for that being, of course, is all 3 of those books relate to the history of the Jewish people after the Babylonian exile. Regarding the writer and the date of the book, even though some ancient sources attributed the book of Esther to the men of the great synagogue or to Esther's guardian, Mordecai, there is no clear evidence pointing to who the writer was. It is questionable whether the men of the great synagogue even existed during the days of Ezra, as the Talmud indicates. And regarding Mordecai being its writer, it seems highly unlikely that he would use the kind of elevated language describing himself that you find in Esther chapter 10 at verse 3. The book does say that Mordecai recorded these events in chapter 9 and verse 20, but the reference appears to be a limited reference to a recording of the Jews' victory over their enemies and their subsequent celebration of the Feast of Purim. No doubt, the one who wrote this book, whomever that was, used Mordecai's writings, as well as the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia, and he was likely a Persian Jew and had access to these records. And the work, scholars tell us, shows great familiarity with the Persian language and with their customs. The date of the book is unknown. The date it was written is not known with any surety, even though there is general agreement on all sides that the events that it records took place around 480 BC. It must not have been written before the death of Xerxes in about 465 BC, since the text speaks of his reign as if it has ended. The fact is that there is good reason to believe that the book was written earlier than many would attribute it. John Bender Samuel argued that the Hebrew used in the book of Esther varies tremendously from the Hebrew of the 2nd century BC, which we now know because of extensive writings that have been recovered from Qumran. And so there is a difference in the language. It would be like comparing the Elizabethan English that the King James Bible was originally written in and contemporary English. And so because of that, scholars have ceased to insist on a late date for the book. Dr. Gleason L. Archer Jr. believed that it must have been written during the Persian period before the conquest of Alexander the Great, about 330 BC. And his reasoning is that there are no traces of Greek influence or Greek thought discovered in this book. The most likely date for the writing of Esther is in the second half of the 5th century BC, not long after the events recorded in the book occurred. Chapter 9 in the book of Esther makes it clear that the Feast of Purim had already been observed when the book was written, implying that some time had passed between the occurrence of the events described in the book and the writing of Esther. The writer, as I've said, cannot be identified, but he may well have been an eyewitness of the events that are depicted, and he may even have been an associate or a friend of Mordecai. When we go to consider the book in terms of its historical setting, we look at that a little deeper, and we realize that because of Judah's sins, God had caused the Jews to be taken into captivity by the Babylonians in 586 BC. They'd been warned and warned again for centuries and continued to practice rebellion, and the Lord's patience ran out, and he used the Babylonians to punish his people, his recalcitrant people. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, defeated the Babylonians about 539 BC and took over the empire. And they expanded their rule over other nations until the Persian Empire was greater in scope and size than anything that had existed up to that time, and as far as recorded history goes. It extended from India all the way to Ethiopia. The Persians attempted to expand the empire to the west, but they were defeated by the Greeks in 480 BC and subsequently withdrew eastward into what today is part of Turkey. The Jews throughout the post-exilic period were subject people to the Persians. Cyrus ultimately allowed them to return to Judah in 538 BC, and the first people to return were led by Zerubbabel or Sheshbazzar, but many stayed in Babylon. They had become successful, and they had no desire to go back to their homeland. One more return is mentioned in the Bible. Ezra led another group of Jews to Judah about 485 BC, and Nehemiah went to Jerusalem about 445 BC, as you know, to reconstruct the walls around the city. Still, many of the Jews remained scattered throughout the Persian Empire. For instance, in the 5th century BC, there was a Jewish colony with a temple at Elephantine in Egypt. The storyline of the book of Esther is set in the city of Susa. It is one of the capital cities of the empire. The king that was reigning at the time was a man by the name of Ahasuerus, and he has been identified as Xerxes I. He reigned from about 486 to 465 BC. And the events in the narrative occur about 480 BC, after the first return of the Jews, but before Ezra and Nehemiah went to Judah. The book, in terms of its contents, we see it beginning with the description of a great banquet given by the emperor Ahasuerus and the leader of the Persians, and it's given to the rulers, the under rulers, who he has conquered, that live throughout his domain. And he commands his queen, Queen Vashti, to display her beauty to those present at this party. It is highly likely that the display of her beauty was not going to be anything that you would learn about in Sunday school. And she declined the invitation to be thus paraded among a bunch of men who no doubt had been partaking of copious quantities of wine and what have you. And as a result of her refusal, she was deposed from being the queen. This is in chapter 1. Thus, Ahasuerus seeks a replacement. And he came up with the idea of holding a kind of a beauty contest. And Esther, a Jewess, who was an orphan who had been adopted by her cousin Mordecai, won the contest. However, she did not reveal her nationality to the king or to anybody else. That's chapter 2. Meanwhile, her cousin Mordecai learns about a plot that is afoot with the king as the target. And he reports it and saves the king's life. That's also in chapter 2. When Mordecai later refused to bow to Haman, a favorite servant of the king, Haman's hatred for Mordecai was intense. And it motivated him to put together a plot to have all of the Jews killed. He influenced the king to issue a proclamation that on a date to be announced, that the Jews throughout the empire were to be slaughtered and their goods were to be confiscated. That's chapter 3. Now, mind you, Ahasuerus has no idea that his queen is a Jewess. And so this order is given. And when a Persian king gave an order, not even he could rescind it. It couldn't be changed. So Mordecai, after learning about this plan, goes to Esther, and he begs her to intercede with the king on behalf of the Jewish people. Esther knows that going into the king uninvited, to come into his presence without a prior invitation, was to take her life in her hands, that she could be executed on the spot. That's chapter 4. But Esther decided to do it. And so she approaches the king, and he welcomes her. Then she invites the king and Haman to dine in her quarters. And at the banquet, she asks only that the king and Haman return for another banquet the next night. That's chapter 5. And Haman left that banquet filled with pride, for he was a prideful man. And he was convinced that he was being honored by the king and the queen. And so that blew his ego up even more. And so he goes home, and at the advice of his wife and some of his friends, Haman orders the construction of a gallows that is 75 feet tall, and his intention is to hang his enemy Mordecai on that gallows. The king couldn't sleep that night, so he had some of his official records read back to him. And in those records, he learned that Mordecai had been responsible for saving his life on the earlier occasion, but had not received any reward for doing that. You say, how could he not know that? Well, those kinds of things are usually kept covert. And these records, no doubt, were not open to everyone. So the next day, the king asked Haman, said, what should you do if you wanted especially to honor someone? And Haman, thinking that the king was going to honor him, because he is such a prideful man, replied that the person should be adorned with a royal robe and paraded through the city as an attendant cried out that the king was honoring him. King likes the idea, and so he orders Haman to do that very thing for Mordecai. Chapter 6. At the second banquet, Queen Esther exposes the plot to kill her people, and she points to Haman as being the individual responsible. The king had Haman hanged on the gallows that had been built for Mordecai. Chapter 7. And since the king's proclamation could not be repealed, the Jews were given permission, given the right to defend themselves against their enemies. Chapter 8. And the ultimate results were that the Jews killed many of their enemies. They were successful. There was tension in the empire, obviously. The Jews had become influential and very successful in Persia. And there was an element that resented their presence, they resented their success, and they came after them with a vengeance, and they ran into a very capable group of people, and they lost the battle. And the result was that Mordecai ends up as the prime minister of the king. And the Jews celebrated their deliverance by observing the Feast of Purim from that time forward. That's in chapter 9. Now, we want to take a few minutes to consider the emphases in the book. The major emphasis, the primary emphasis, is the salvation of the Jews, of course, from annihilation, which was accomplished by God, but he accomplished it through Mordecai and Esther. All the events in the early part of the story that the book relates, Esther's becoming queen, Haman's near insane hostility towards Mordecai and all the Jews, Mordecai's appeal to Esther to go before the king, and all these other incidents are used to set the stage for the Jews' deliverance. That's the emphasis. Perhaps the most intriguing fact about the book is that God's name is nowhere mentioned within it. Nevertheless, his presence is felt at every juncture. It is seen on every page. To use the words of Charles R. Swindoll, and I quote, "More than any other biblical book, Esther is a tribute to the invisible providence of God." Mr. Swindoll, I believe to be correct there. The Lord's hand is seen moving throughout the story that it tells. And the first readers would certainly have discerned that God was at work in the events of the narrative in order to deliver his people of promise. It's been said that God is the main character of the book, and in some ways that's certainly true. He's the main character in existence, in what is. It's even been said that God is the main character of the book, nevertheless, and so the question of why the book of Esther does not mention God has often been discussed. It is really one of those kinds of questions that comes up in Bible classes, and people discuss or argue their various points to an indeterminate end and then move on to something else that nobody knows the answer to. And so it is not wrong to be curious about it, but we don't want to spend too much time with something that cannot be definitively answered. The question, why not? The book should be regarded, of course, some say, because there's various answers given, some say it should be regarded as wisdom literature. Wisdom literature in the Old Testament characteristically does not speak of God's name or of specifically religious practices, but it speaks of wisdom, possibly. Secondly, some argue the account was written to be included in the Persian archives, and that the writer thought it best to omit the name of the Lord, lest these people who were pagans substitute one of their false gods for the Lord. Well, that seems to be a leap, but that's what the argument is. Thirdly, the absence of God's name, some say, indicates the hiddenness of God. When God hides himself, when he withdraws his presence from his people, he does so to indicate his displeasure, and we know that's true sometimes. And God was displeased with these Jews of Susa, and perhaps with the Jews throughout the Gentile world. They had refused, many of them, an opportunity to go back to the Holy Land and fulfill mission that God has given them. So in the book itself, in the actions of Mordecai, and the actions of Esther, demonstrates their moral and ethical shortcomings. The Lord necessarily uses flawed people to accomplish his purposes. Remember what we learn in the New Testament, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we see that. God implied that he didn't approve of those Jews by causing his name to be left out of the book. That's the way it's argued. Nevertheless, in spite of his disapproval, he condescended to save them. Well, there may be merit in some of those arguments, some of those suggestions, but the fact is nobody really knows why the inspired writer chose not to mention God's name specifically in the writing of this book. We don't know why. And perhaps it's omitted to emphasize that even when God remains silent, he is still active, still working on behalf of his people, and that you can still trust in him to work his purposes. Perhaps that's why. When we get to the other side, we can ask and get that clarified. Purpose of the book, the main purpose of the book, may have been to reassure the readers that in spite of their being scattered, God was watching over them. After all, he's not, as the pagans conceived of it, a localized deity that has, boundaries on the earth that he has no authority beyond. But he is the God of all that is. He could and he would still deliver them, even in unpromising circumstances. And perhaps he would do that using unexpected means or methods. The text serves that purpose very well. This text does. You read the book. From a religious standpoint, the book of Esther demonstrates important truths. It teaches vital lessons about God's work in people's lives. From a historical standpoint, it explains the origin of the Feast of Purim. This feast didn't originate in the law that was given by God to Israel through Moses. That's found in the Pentateuch. Yet it was observed in later years, with the Lord registering no objection to that. How did it originate? Esther answers the question. From an apologetic standpoint, the book may have been used to explain the Jewish presence in Susa and the heavy Jewish presence in the Persian government. As was noted earlier, they had gone there as captives, but they had distinguished themselves and they'd risen to positions of prominence. Some of them had, several of them had, within that Persian Empire, and it may have been that was being explained. Some later king may have wondered why in the world Mordecai, a man from a defeated people, was the prime minister of the empire. How did that come to be? And so, while Ahasuerus is not depicted as a wicked, evil man, the text hints at his incompetence, that he may very well appears not to have been always a very able administrator. And a later king would have appreciated the fact that while the king was honored in these records, it was also the case that it was noted that he had capable helpers that he needed. And that may have made him feel good, that, well, I didn't need that. We don't know for sure, but it is the case that the book does make an apologetic for, give us a reason for Jews in the place they were. The value of the book, the story of Esther, is exciting. It is suspenseful. It's even entertaining. It wasn't written for that purpose primarily, but the events are that. But it also teaches important lessons about how God cares for his people. And we will find woven into the plot some principles that we ought to apply as we seek to live in his presence today. The book of Esther shows, for example, the importance of the Jewish people to the plan of God. When the narrative tells how the Jews, through God's providence, escaped annihilation on this one occasion, it implies that they, as a people, have a significant role to play in God's plan of redemption. God had promised to save the world through the seed of Abraham. That was a covenant that God himself made with this man. And the promise continued through the nation of Israel. If God had allowed Israel to be exterminated in Persia, as Haman tried to engineer it, he would have been surrendering his purpose to defeat. The book certainly emphasizes the Jewishness of God's people. The word Jew in its singular or plural form is found over 50 times in the 10 chapters of Esther. That's more than it occurs in all the Old Testament put together, all the books combined. In Esther, Mordecai expressed his belief that relief and deliverance would arise from the Jews, whether the queen helped or not, even if she failed to intercede on their behalf. He said it will arise. Relief will arise from within the Jews. That's chapter 4, verse 14. Even the Gentiles declared that since Mordecai was a Jew, that Haman could not overcome him, but would surely fall before him. Chapter 6 and verse 13. Many among the Gentiles in Persia became Jews because they learned to fear the Jews. Chapter 8, verse 17. They were not a people to be trifled with. The book concludes by telling how Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and that's the way he's described in chapter 10 and verse 3. It was intended to prove that the Jews, because of God's help, were invincible, that they could not be defeated, and that anybody who tried to destroy them would himself be destroyed. The book was, or has been criticized, I should say, for its extreme nationalism. But when it is viewed in regard to God's redemptive purpose, it is not merely a story about the triumph of the Jews. Rather, it is about the triumph of God's plan to bring man back to himself through his election and preservation of Israel. The Jews could not be destroyed because God intended to use them to accomplish His purposes and fulfill His promises. This book demonstrates the providence of God. The story of Esther shows how the Lord can providentially accomplish His will, even in an alien environment. Although God is not mentioned in the text, His presence, of course, is felt, guiding and directing events so that the ultimate outcome of the story will serve His purpose. Mordecai's words to Esther express his and the writer's belief in God's providence. Notice chapter 4 of the book, verses 13 and 14. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." And so, the providence of God, we see the curtain pulled back, if you will, and we see the providence of God on behalf of His people. And that providence, ladies and gentlemen, is operative at this hour, as it always has been, as it shall be until Christ comes. This book reveals the necessity of reacting wisely when we're presented with difficult challenges. Although the Jews are saved through God's providence, the shrewd actions of Mordecai and Esther certainly contribute to their deliverance. The story demonstrates, therefore, that God's will can be accomplished in human affairs if people will do their best and trust God to do the rest. This book highlights the relationship of the Jews with the Gentiles. And that's one of the most pressing questions that was encountered by post-exilic Jews. They've been carried away from their homeland. They live among Gentiles. They have to conduct business with Gentiles. How are they supposed to relate to these people? That's a question that all of those people in that period, post-exile, after the exile, have to wrestle with. Their relationship with the peoples of the lands is a major concern in both Ezra and Nehemiah, the two post-exilic historical books. The Jews living outside of Palestine would have been especially concerned with this issue since they were surrounded by people of the other nations. And among the questions that must have troubled the Jews were these. Is it possible for us to survive or even prosper living among Gentiles? Can that be? Can we do that? What should we expect from our Gentile neighbors? How should we act toward Gentiles that are around us? What should we expect, and what should be our relationship to the pagan government under which we live? You talk about a pertinent question in the 21st century. There's one. Do we have any hope of triumphing over Gentile enemies? See, the book was written to help them answer some of those questions. In the context of Esther and Mordecai's experiences, the Jews are depicted in the following ways throughout the book. I'll just run through it really quickly. They are helpers of the king and his empire. We see that in chapter 2. They live by what is acknowledged to be a different law, chapter 3, verse 8. They are falsely accused of failing to keep the king's laws, also chapter 3 and verse 8. They are honored by the authorities, ultimately in chapter 6. They achieve high ranks in the governments, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. You'll see those. They are appreciated by their neighbors, chapter 8. They are respected and feared by everybody, Chapter 6 and chapter 8 and chapter 9, you'll see references to those things. And they are victors over their adversaries, also in a number of places. The Jews in the Persian Empire are presented as having been both popular and prosperous. And Mordecai seems to have been wealthy enough to spend his days sitting at the gate of the king's palace, chapter 2. The news that the Jews were to be destroyed through the city of Susa into utter turmoil in chapter 3, and the fact that the Jews' enemies coveted their goods suggests that they were wealthy, that they were, as a people, they were prosperous, quite prosperous, chapter 3. Also, the book discusses the various ways the Gentiles related to God's people. Some are seen to be enemies of the Jews, and God achieved his purpose in spite of them. In fact, they were killed, and the Jews acquired greater prestige as a result of that unjustified attack. Secondly, some were friends of the Jews, and God led them to play various roles in achieving his purposes. For example, the man who was in charge of the Persian king's harem helped Esther and Mordecai in chapter 2. The Persian king Ahasuerus, ultimately in the providence of God, became the benefactor of the Jewish people. Also, when the Jews fought against their enemies, and on the appointed day, the Gentile rulers of their various provinces joined in and assisted them in chapter 9 at verse 3. Thirdly, some became Jews, according to Esther chapter 8 and verse 17, and the statement suggests that God welcomed those people to be among his people and that the Jews should accept these converts. The first readers would have been encouraged by the positive picture of the Jews in the book and would have concluded that they didn't have anything to fear from their Gentile neighbors. And after all, God's sovereignty applies to all nations everywhere at all times. In their dealings with the Gentiles, the Jews knew that the Lord would watch over them and that some of the people around them could help them, either by befriending them or joining with them. How should we interpret the book of Esther? That question arises because several questionable moral issues are raised in the book. Was it a commendable thing for Vashti to refuse to parade herself before these men at this banquet? And if so, should Esther have entered the beauty contest to replace her, or any beauty contest? Should she, a Jewess, have married a foreigner, a Gentile? Should Esther have concealed her nationality from her husband? Was it right for Esther and Mordecai to seek the king's permission to slaughter the Jews' enemies? Commentators have approached the question of the apparent alleged moral lapses in Esther in different ways. More critical writers have cited these perceived moral shortcomings as providing a good reason for declaring the book to be worthless. Other commentators, believing in inspiration and counting Esther and Mordecai as heroes of the faith, seek to justify everything these two characters did. Another approach has been to downplay the apparent immoral actions in the story by interpreting them symbolically. The first group that try to throw the book out are just wrong, and the other two are trying to dodge difficult questions, in my opinion. I believe the best approach, I would agree with Dr. Roper here, that the best approach to understand the book is simply to interpret it as a historical account and give your interpretation accordingly. Old Testament history was not written primarily to present the heroes in a good light or a perfect light so that later generations would mimic them in everything they said or did. In general, biblical historians from Genesis through Esther told stories as they happened, as they occurred, without trying to teach moral lessons. And when a biblical writer desired to use a Bible example for good or bad, they made that point very clearly and plainly. Their aim, rather than providing moral guidance, was to reveal the working of God in the affairs of man, and as he acted to bring mankind back to him through the plan of redemption. That's what their aim was. Biblical writers left it to their readers to exercise their own responsibility to determine whether or not a particular act or a particular character ought to be praised or condemned, based, of course, on the principles revealed in the law. Bible students should not ever assume that everything done by those whom God has approved of was considered to be the right thing. For example, Noah and Abraham and Moses and Samson and Hezekiah all sinned at one time or another. Therefore, we must not assume that everything that Esther or Mordecai said or did met with God's approval because they were nevertheless used by him to save the Jewish people. When interpreting the book, we should ask two questions. What is God doing in the story? And secondly, what did God hope to accomplish through the telling of the story? We can be certain that he did not intend the first readers or any subsequent readers of the book to enter beauty contests and kill all their adversaries. We'll begin next time with chapter 1. God bless you this day. Thank you for being a part of our study.